peace, bring it all to peace. The storm surrounding me, let it break. At your name, still, call the sea to still, the rage in me to still every wave. At your name, Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, 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 you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, 'cause your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Oh, your name cannot be overcome. Your name is a light, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Sing his name. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, 'cause your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Oh, your name cannot be overcome. No, it can't. No, it can't. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. So we sing his name. Oh, Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome.
Well, hello everyone, Pastor Michael here, and I'm so glad to be with you as we conclude the series that we have been in for the past few weeks here at Long Hill Chapel called In the Meantime. If you're a follower of Jesus, we have a great and glorious conclusion to the story that we look forward to. The day where faith becomes sight, where we're face to face with Jesus, where all is made right, where restoration happens, where justice is served, and where there's this grand culmination of history when Jesus returns. And that's our great and glorious hope, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, that is how things end. But we live in the meantime. We live in a set of circumstances where we hold on to faith and we walk forward each day. But we do so knowing that things aren't complete yet, that we haven't seen the fullness or the fulfillment yet. We haven't seen everything made right yet. Certainly at a point like right now in our own history, we turn on the news or we look around our world and we see all of the places where it seems like there's this great distance between where we find ourselves and that great grand culmination of history where Jesus gets the final word. And so we live in the meantime. And today what I want to do is I want to turn us in a direction where we can look forward and we can look forward with joy at the life that we have as we walk out these days, even as difficult sometimes as they are in the world that we're in. And I want to connect where we were this past week, where we looked at something that's a little down and depressing, if we're honest with ourselves, but it's very important for how we're able to continue to walk forward in the midst of circumstances that don't always go the way that we would expect that they should. We looked last week at the principle and the practice that we have of lament, where grief, where mourning is actually an act of worship that we can do, where we bring all the things that we carry and we lay them down before God. But today we're going to look ahead. You know, one of the things that's interesting is periodically there's a survey that goes out in the world and it asks people really, what are the top 10 things that they're afraid of? And the list is always varied. Actual death is always on the list. But one of the things that's interesting that's usually on the list, and it's number one or two very often, is most people are afraid of public speaking. They just don't like the idea that they would have to get up in front of a group of people and they'd have to share. And what's interesting, at least in one list, is public speaking rates higher than actual death. So there's some people, and maybe you're one of those people, who you'd rather actually die than stand in front of a crowded room full of people and try to talk. But one of the things that's common in all of those lists is that the things that are on them, the fears that people have, all are centered around rejection, they're centered around pain, or they're centered around failure. When you think about what those things are, rejection, pain, and failure, really in a very small way, and sometimes even a little bit of a bigger way, is they represent death. Because all of us feel like death, it's the end of our lives, it's the end of our existence as we know it. Certainly, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you believe that death isn't the end, but it's a transition from this state to the eternal state that we have with Jesus Christ. But all of these other things in our lives, in a way, they represent smaller versions of death, smaller versions of dying. Rejection is the death of the hopes that we have in relationships. Pain, it's the death of how we thought life was going to be, and certainly failure is the death of how we thought things were going to go. And so in the meantime in our lives, very often we live in the shadow of death. Certainly actual death, but all of these other things as well. And if we're not careful, it comes to define how we live, how we see the world, and how we move forward in life, even sometimes when we're Christians. Because it's possible for us to live in such a way that, yes, we look ahead to the ultimate conclusion where Jesus gets the final word, but we forget to live fully the life that he has given us here and given us right now. And I believe that for us who follow Jesus, there's a different way that we can live. About 20 some years ago, my wife Grace and I were married, and we stayed some of our first nights as a married couple in a DoubleTree hotel. Maybe you've stayed in one. We have a couple here locally in New Jersey, but it's a chain that's all over the world. And one of the things that's unique about DoubleTree is that when you go in, and I believe they still do this, I haven't been there recently, but they give you these fresh baked chocolate chip cookies, and they're really, really good cookies. And I remember the first time my wife and I, Grace, we checked in and we got the cookies, and probably over the course of the next few days, we ate a lot more of those cookies than we should have. We'd go back down to the front and we'd get more. And what we tried to do over the next few years is we tried to duplicate the recipe. My wife bakes, and she's an amazing cook, and I do a little bit of that as well. And we try to figure out what it was that made those cookies special. And what we discovered as we dug in a little more and figured it out is there's some secret ingredients that really set those things apart, those cookies apart, from all the other chocolate chip cookies that we'd had or that you might hope to have throughout your life. And this thing that helps us live life in a different way. Not just waiting, not just hanging on, not just being tossed to and fro by the circumstances of our lives, our world, and our news cycle. It's like a secret ingredient. It sets it apart. It makes it completely different. And for Christians, that secret ingredient is this thing called hope. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The Apostle Paul was one of the early writers to the New Testament churches. He was one of the early leaders of the church, and he would write letters to various congregations that were scattered all around the area and encourage them. He'd correct them, he'd challenge them, he'd exhort them to keep going, he'd confront them on some issues, but he'd help them stay on course. And there's a book or a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a church in Thessalonica. There's actually two of them in our Bible, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And this was widely regarded as one of the first letters that the Apostle Paul wrote to a group of Christians. And what was happening in Thessalonica is there was a group of people who had come to faith in Jesus. And it was such a big deal for them. They saw the hope that it represented, that they were actually quitting their jobs because they expected Jesus to return at any moment. And so they were just kind of packing up their lives and getting ready because they thought it was going to happen right now. And maybe a few of you grew up that way, or maybe even still you feel that way, and it's such a hopeful thing. But as time passes, we face the fact that maybe we've been called to live a life here. And that's what was happening with the church in Thessalonica, because people were beginning to die out. And there was this real concern for the folks that were there that they were missing out on something, or they were missing something, or maybe they had misunderstood what Jesus meant. And so the Apostle Paul writes into this tension in the book of 1 Thessalonians. And in a way, it's the same tension that we feel. It's this idea that we have this great and glorious hope. And maybe when you first came to faith in Jesus, you felt it so keenly, but then you went through some of the circumstances of your life. And your life didn't get easier. Maybe it even got harder as a result of your decision to follow Jesus. And just like the Apostle Paul did into that early space, I believe he speaks to us in our time, where we begin to feel the tension of the now versus the not yet, versus the present moment and the ultimate conclusion that we feel that we are living in this moment. The hope that we have in the end, but the tension between that and how do we live right now and in this moment. In Thessalonica, there was actually a philosophical movement that had taken root that really had no hope whatsoever. Historians regard that there was a gravestone, at least one, if not more than one, in Thessalonica that represented the mainstream philosophy of the time. And it's very, very encouraging and helpful and hopeful and cheery. And it goes like this. This was actually written on a gravestone in Thessalonica. After death, no reviving. After the grave, no meeting again. So it's just absolutely hopeless. And there was no hope represented in that system. And perhaps the Apostle Paul, he had heard about this, or he'd seen it, or some of the people there had told him about it. And so he was speaking into that exact situation and to that exact train of thought as he was writing in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and beginning at verse 13. And for some of us, maybe you've been to a Christian funeral, or maybe this is just one of those passages you hold on to. This is an incredible reminder of the hope that we have in Jesus. And he writes like this. He says, "Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death." Catch the language there. It's not even final, conclusive language. It's like sleep. Sleep is something we do, and then we wake up. And so the Apostle Paul uses that same language. "So that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope." And there I believe he was speaking specifically to this situation in Thessalonica, that gravestone and that philosophy that just said, once you hit death, that's it. There's nothing more, there's nothing past it. Death is the end. "For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep. Once again, notice the language there, in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. And so he's reminding his audience there that there's hope even sometimes when it seems like there's no hope. Even in the circumstances that seem like death, because of Jesus, death is not the end. It's not the final chapter of the story. And then he reminds his audience, and I believe he reminds us as well, when he says this: Jesus is coming. You haven't been forgotten. That's what he talks about next. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. And so he talks about the future hope that we have at the conclusion of the story. But then there's one more line that he adds at the very end. He says this: therefore, encourage one another with these words. And so he reminds his audience that even in the midst of their circumstances, which weren't what they thought, things were taking longer than they expected, Jesus is still coming. They haven't been forgotten. And to remind each other and encourage each other with these words. Jesus has triumphed over death. And that's one of the key things that we believe as Christians. But did you also know that not only did he defeat big death, he defeated death at the end of our lives so that it is not a permanent state. It's not the conclusion like those ancient philosophers thought. It's not even what our world around us sees. It's a transitionary thing. We've fallen asleep and we're brought into the presence of God for those who are in Jesus. But here's the good news for now. He's also triumphed over all of the little deaths, all of those smaller things that represent death for us. And he's done it beginning right now. Here's what this literally means. Those things are not the end. You and I, very often in our lives, we have something that feels like the end. It feels like there's nothing more to be said, nothing more to be done, nothing more to be written. It just feels like it is the closure of a chapter or the closure of a book, and there's nothing more that can be gained. And we mourn it and we move on. What if it wasn't? What if because of Jesus, all of those things that seemed like the end of a relationship, the end of a chapter of life, the end of a season, the end of a time that we thought would never end, what if they weren't? What if there was something else there? And what I'm not trying to say is that somehow bad things, we've all experienced some bad things and some very difficult things. I'm not trying to say that somehow those are good. But because of Jesus, it's possible that they can at least have purpose. And in order for that to happen, something needs to change in how we get to hope. Some of us right now, we're facing something that feels like death. Maybe it's actual death. Maybe it's an illness or disease, or maybe the circumstances of the past few years where we've seen death and suffering really all around us in a profound way. They're just weighing on us. And what we are to do is what we talked about last week, is to face into all of the realities of what that represents, to lament the tension that we feel, but to realize that it's not final and it's not the end. Because as we turn and we face those things, we don't face them alone. We need to lament, we need to grieve, we need to walk through, but we also walk through it with Jesus. Without us facing down death, without us facing down loss, without us facing down suffering and pain and grieving and lamenting, Jesus becomes a source of comfort, but never a source of hope or a source of healing. What happened in the ancient culture, in the ancient Jewish world, is whenever they would encounter this, especially around the passing of loved ones, is they'd set aside specific time for this. And that's something we don't do nearly as well in our culture. But here's the other thing. Without Jesus, If you just grieve, if you just lament, if you just look around your world and you say, woe is the world, woe are all the things I'm encountering and that I'm facing that I never thought I'd face. Isn't it bad? Where's God in all of this? But we don't walk into those things with Jesus. Grieving is simply an exercise to try to find closure. It still feels like an ending. But the very essence of what our faith is it's looking past that point. It's holding on to Jesus, but then it's walking through what seems like a wall, what seems like an ending, to discover something else. That's really the very definition of what faith is. There's another book in the New Testament called the book of Hebrews, and there's a famous set of verses in chapter 11 there where the writer talks about what faith is and what it looks like. And he says this in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and it's assurance about what we do not see. Because when you have hope, any kind of hope, there's a part of the picture that you see, but there's another part of the picture that you know that you don't see yet. And so when we hope things will improve, or we hope the weather will change, or we hope our circumstances will change, we are holding on to something that we do see, but we also are believing that there's something more that we don't see. But here's where this becomes critically important. Because not only having hope matters, but what we have placed our hope in is absolutely crucial. Because hope, it's not just this nebulous feeling that you and I try to conjure up and make ourselves feel better. It has to be anchored in something, or it has to be anchored in someone. It's really where we're placing our confidence. And here's the tricky part. Our hope, or where our hope is placed, it's not tested when things are good, but it's tested when they're not, when we face big and difficult circumstances. And when that happens, I believe we can respond in one of about 4 different ways. When we're faced with things that require us to dip into our reservoir of hope, where we know that we see things the way they are, and it's maybe not what we prefer to see, but we believe and we hold on to the reality that there's something else coming. There's something that we don't see yet. You and I, we can have hope in ourselves, and really that's just a confidence based on what I can see and what I can control. And if you're anything like me, the circumstances of our lives overwhelm us, and we realize how short that falls. It's good in the good times, but it's not nearly enough in the difficult times, because really what it's asking us to do is to be God. The second thing we can do is we can have hope in circumstances or other people. But here's the problem. Like we talked about last week, circumstances always change. Life is this constant cycle of joy and sorrow and sorrow and joy. And when you and I place our confidence in our circumstances, we really are getting aboard a roller coaster, because they will change sooner than we know it. And what we're tempted to do when our circumstances change is we are tempted to see them as a reflection on ourselves, or even as a reflection on God. I've discovered in my time in ministry and serving people as a pastor in the church that there's a lot of people who say that they hope in Jesus, but what they actually hope in is something else. Because remember what I said, when things are good, the object of your hope isn't really tested. But then circumstances change, and the real source of their hope is revealed. Life is simply uncertain. One day can be a good day and the next day and not, and vice versa, because our circumstances are always changing. And it's tempting for us to allow our circumstances to become the barometer of God's affection for us. But instead, when we place our hope somewhere else, when we place it in God, we discover that the things around us, there's going to be up and there's going to be down. There's going to be good and there's going to be bad. There's going to be sorrow and there's going to be joy. But that is not the thing that determines God's care for us and God's presence with us. So we can have hope in ourselves. We can have hope in our circumstances. Some of us, truly, honestly, we don't have much hope at all. We have no hope, and that's the third thing. We believe that we have no impact in our lives, that our lives have no impact. And really what we believe subtly, even though we might pray, even though we might have faith in God, is we believe that nothing is really going to change. We believe that God is somehow powerful, but he's distant and he's limited and removed from our circumstances, and nothing will change. And what happens as a result of this is we never risk. We never pray big prayers. We never take a step out where there might be a step of faith involved. And what happens sometimes with this, and I've discovered this in my own life, is this happens when we face disappointment and loss, and we're just afraid to risk again, and we don't want to be hurt. We don't want to put ourselves out there. We don't want to get our hopes up. And so we live without a lot of hope. You know what I believe is true is that the opposite of hope, it's not despair, it's apathy. The opposite of hope is when we simply stop caring. But the last place, as you might imagine, where I'm going to go with this, that we can place our hope is in God. We can place our confidence, we can live our lives out of a hope in God. Just like the writer in Hebrews said, it's rooted in things we don't see yet, but it's centered on who we believe God is. And there's times where this is a really challenging thing for us because it requires a very long view of our lives and of our circumstances. And that's really what God's view is. Because hope, it has one foot firmly planted in the present moment, but another one planted in the future because of something that we don't see yet. But here's the crazy thing with all of this talk about hope. Over time, I believe, and I've experienced this, and maybe you have too, you become and your life becomes the narrative that you choose to embrace. Your attitude towards hope is largely determined by how you live every single day. St. Augustine had this quote that kind of illustrates this, where he said this: habit is, if not resisted, it soon becomes necessity. So if there's this thing we tend towards, and we don't discipline ourselves and order our lives to live in a different direction, that actually starts to become our default over time. And like I said a little bit before, the really tricky part of this is when things are good, where we put our hope is not absolutely critical. It's not absolutely indispensable because it doesn't matter as much where our confidence has been built. In good times, we can have hope in ourselves. In good times, we can have hope in our circumstances. It's only when those things change that the true object of where our hope has been placed becomes absolutely important. And I'd say it like this: where you've placed your hope doesn't matter much until it really matters. So in most days, it's not absolutely important, but in the moments where it is, it absolutely matters where you put your hope. Let me illustrate. It would be like if you had learned to play the clarinet all your life. You practiced, you owned the instrument, you knew it really, really well. And you walked into church one day, and myself or Joey handed you a guitar and said, "Here, you're going to play this in 10 minutes. Good luck, get ready." How would that go? It wouldn't go well at all because the thing you practiced was completely different than the thing you needed to be able to play in the moment. What you'd do is you'd probably either run back out the door or you'd go searching around the building to try to find something you were familiar with. You'd go try to find that clarinet and play that. The same happens with hope. If we have practiced putting our hope in ourselves, or we've practiced putting our hope in our circumstances, and suddenly we're faced with a situation in our lives where we really need our hope to matter, we can't suddenly shift it into God in those moments. We don't do that very easily. Instead, we stay in the places that we've practiced. An old music teacher of mine said it this way: practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. The things that you practice are the things that you will become, and they'll be what you reach for when the moment hits. And this is actually why I believe many people, including many Christians, over the past few years, we've really struggled. Because up until that point, what we put our hope in wasn't as critical, and then the circumstances changed. And we found ourselves grasping for something else. You know, because even Christians can pay lip service to hope in Jesus, but practice, actually live out their lives with their hope being placed in so many other things: economics, job security, circumstances, health, physical strength, politics, security, any number of things. And we discover that when our cage gets rattled, that we reach for those things and they're not there. But here's the good news, is that Jesus is always there. When we put our hope in God, it's a hope that is not shaken. As the old hymn writer said, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. And so as we figure out how to put this into practice, what are some steps that we can take to live with our hope put and built in the right place? Here's how we begin. First thing is this: I think hope is a decision we make. That's really what faith is. Most of you who are watching me, maybe not all of you, but most of you, you have made a decision to put your faith in Jesus Christ. But it's now time to make a decision to live your life with all of your hope in Jesus. Not that he's your backup plan, but that he's where you've put your hope. It begins with that decision. But then it's a practice. It's a thing we do day in and day out. You know, we talk about prayer and worship and coming to church and belief as kind of some of the practices, serving, giving, all the things that are practices of our Christian faith. But I believe hope is as much a practice as any one of those other things. And it's the thing that separates our faith, our belief, from every other religious system. Because our hope isn't just, in wishful thinking or circumstances. Our hope is a living hope. It's in Jesus Christ. And our practice needs to be anchored there. Who he was, what he said, and how he shows us to live. But not only those things, but the power that he gives us through his Spirit to live every single day. But then there's one more thing. And I think we see it in that last verse of that passage from the book of 1 Thessalonians that we read, where the Apostle Paul, as he ends this reminder of who Jesus is and how it's all going to play out, he says this: therefore, encourage each other with these words. In the midst of life, and especially in the midst of difficulty, it is so easy for us to forget this, to be bowled over by the wind and the waves of our circumstances and our world. And one of the things that we can do for each other is remind each other of what is true. I believe hope is a team sport. It's why we gather in some form, whether it's digitally like this or in person, every single week. It's why this life was not meant to be done alone. It's also why you need a handful of people in your life who you know and are known to, who can point you back in the right direction, back to Jesus, that your hope would be built in the right place. And even on the good days where you could put your hope in any number of other things without a lot of consequence, instead, you and I choose to build our hope in Jesus. And that's how we live in hope. That's how, when the moment does come, we hold on to the right things and we're not shaken by the winds and the waves of our circumstances or the events in the world around us. Because we know how it ends. We believe, we've been given a picture of how it ends, that the Lord himself will return. He'll come down from heaven. He will make it right. We'll be caught up with those who have gone before us. And so, as the Apostle Paul says, we will be with the Lord forever. So that's the ending. But we've been called to live in the meantime. We've been called to live with hope. Would you pray with me? God, I pray you would restore our hope today. That you'd point us back to the source, that it's not our ability to control or manage our circumstances or understand life. It's not when the things in our life are up and we put our hope in those. It's not when we just give up hoping at all and settle for very little. It's when we put our hope in you. Would you help us do that today? And would you remind us that you're present, that you will get the final word, but you've called us to live with purpose, with expectation, with hope here in the meantime. We thank you for our time together. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.